For those of you that were out last night, it was an early morning. Welcome to the Arctic Coastal Infrastructure Mitigating Environmental Impacts panel this morning. I am not Christy Bell, I'm Heather Paulson. I'm the Director of Research Operations for the University of Alaska Anchorage, and I have the distinguished pleasure of hosting these subject matter experts today and moderating for them. So I'd like each of them to give a little bit of a brief introduction about themselves, and I'll start with Mr. Shannon Jenkins.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Everybody hear me okay? Not sure how sensitive these mics are. Shannon Jenkins, I work with the U.S. Coast Guard. I'm the Senior Arctic Policy Advisor for the service, which means I work across the Coast Guard Polar Enterprise, working with headquarters, the field commands, and then I also work across the interagency on developing U.S. national strategies and policies related to the Arctic region. And I appreciate you guys being here, like Heather said, and look forward to the questions we get from you.
Hi, I'm Leslie Canavera. I'm Yupik, Alaska native. I'm from Alaska. My family's from the ADAC-ARCTIC area, but I was raised in Anchorage. My background, I was an Air Force officer. I did a lot with remote sensing, then went over to NGA, and now I'm the CEO and co-founder of Polarctic, where we build artificial intelligence and machine learning models to forecast environmental change in the Arctic.
Good morning, everyone. Commander Jeremy Altendorf of the U.S. Coast Guard. Spent 6 years at Sector Anchorage as part of a 21-odd-year career in the Coast Guard. Currently assigned to the Ted Stevens Center, and my role at the Sector Anchorage was a number of different things, primarily environmental protection, emergency manager, and as a career regulator advisor on Arctic policy implementation.
All right, good morning. I am Leanne Lusk. I recently retired from the Coast Guard about 3 weeks ago, and after a 25-and-a-half-year career, I was the commander of Sector Anchorage with Jeremy, served with Jeremy, and was in that role for 3 years, working on issues throughout Alaska regarding disaster response, recovery efforts, inspections, et cetera, so definitely relatively new to Alaska, but the last 3 years of experience was pretty awesome, so more to follow there.
Good morning, everyone. Jeff Libby. I'm an associate professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage, also the executive director for the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, which is a Department of Homeland Security Emeritus Center of Excellence. I'm also the director for the Applied Environmental Research Center, which primarily contracts with Department of Defense, as well as the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and more recently, we're contracted to do work with the Department of Interior through a cooperative agreement for the National Park Service. I also provide oversight for our Center for Strategic Partnerships and Research, which provides registered apprenticeship and workforce development opportunities for the next generation of researchers, scientists, educators, and leaders. Thanks for being here.
We hope to have a great dialogue this morning. We will have time for question and answer, so we do hope that you will participate with that and write down your questions in preparation of a question and answer time. This session is being recorded for everyone's awareness so that it can be posted also for our federal partners too on this one. So with that, Leanne, I'm going to start with you. Can you provide an overview of the current state of Arctic coastal infrastructure and the challenges brought on due to climate change?
Absolutely, thank you. So there's quite a lot going on in the state of Alaska and offshore in the environment, both in the Arctic and the Bering Sea. First, we have a lack of fixed shore ice that would normally provide like a protective barrier against the landmass. We also have a lack of multi-year ice, which is different than has happened in the past. We have ice jams and floods in the rivers, and as an example, the Coast Guard had jurisdiction and responsibility for over 4,000 miles or 6,500 kilometers of river environment and the villages that were along those rivers that were navigable waterways. There's significant coastal and shoreline erosion all around Alaska. We've got thawing permafrost, so as far as the infrastructure is concerned, things that were built on the permafrost as it was frozen are now sinking in. We've got, I didn't bring pictures. I don't think, I'm looking at the, diagram real quick. There's basically the structures themselves are starting to sink or lean. And when you talk about fuel facilities, that's a big issue. It's part of the reason why the Coast Guard is in the villages and is doing inspections of those to make sure that we aren't looking at a disaster with the fuel in that region. We saw a 3-degree Fahrenheit temperature increase in the Bering Sea, and just that temperature increase allowed Typhoon Merbok to enter the Aleutian chain and gain power as it hit western Alaska just over a year ago in September of 22. So those are kind of the general environmental impacts, and all of that has impact to the infrastructure that exists in Alaska, in coastal Alaska, and in the Arctic. In addition, there are significant cultural impacts. We can go on about that, but just as a couple examples, we have significant erosion in Shishmaref. That village has chosen to move and relocate. There are still people that live in that village, but there are iconic photos from about 2016 showing houses falling off the cliff or falling off the sandy barrier, I guess, that used to exist and going into the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait. Newtok is another village that has halfway moved. Their new location is 9 miles from their previous location that they had been in since time memoriam. And about half of the villagers have moved, but they have to cross a river to get to that. So you have significant cultural impacts where families are split and living in 2 different locations. From a federal perspective, makes responses very difficult. When they talk about the village of Newtok and the location being Newtok, we have to verify which location we're talking about, if it's the old Newtok or the new Newtok, et cetera. So that kind of sets the stage. Hopefully that puts the perspective and will help fill in the blanks for the rest of the questions.
Jeremy, what role does the U.S. Coast Guard play in inspecting and ensuring the integrity of the Arctic coastal facilities? Can you discuss some of the most pressing infrastructure issues and risks in Alaska's Arctic coastal regions, and how are natural disasters creating new challenges?
So the Coast Guard's role in the Arctic is similar to its role anywhere else in the country. The regulatory services we provide to the regulated community, to the communities in general, is the same. The delivery of those services is what's challenging. So a lot of the reasons we're in coastal facilities is after the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 was passed, a number of regulations, most of the regulations from Open 90 were Coast Guard directed. So a lot of them are about prevention and preparedness, keeping the oil where it belongs, inside tanks, inside pipelines. So our role is if you are fed by a barge and that barge capacity is over 10,500 gallons, then you have to be inspected by the U.S. Coast Guard. Doing that is challenging in the best of scenarios and where there's no road system, and is obviously makes it even more challenging. One of the things that makes this unique for the U.S. Coast Guard in Alaska is those inspections at facilities had not been done uniformly prior to like 2019. So now we're usually at an every other year schedule of actually going to the community and looking and talking to the operators and owners of the facility themselves. And again, making sure that they can transfer the fuel from the barge to the facility safely, and that the oil stays where it belongs, and that the owner and the operator have the proper training. So that's what we do typically. And for us, it's all about compliance assistance. So we want to make sure that the facilities themselves are up to specs and that the oil, again, stays where it's supposed to be. We do that through the prevention and preparedness inspections. When it comes to the most pressing issues, the top 3 really are maintenance and training, making sure facility operators are trained properly. It is difficult to provide training to residents of rural Alaska because there's just not that kind of access. And because the Coast Guard is just in like the 5th or 6th year of really being out there and having these touch points with the regulated community, in Alaska Native communities and other rural communities. It's been an education process for most. I would also add that another pressing issue is the recapitalization and engineering of the facilities themselves. Most of these facilities were built in the 70s, and they did not come with operations and maintenance annual funding. So that puts the onus on the owner-operator, who is challenged financially in several ways, on top of it being a pretty harsh environment where the facilities are located. So that's another pressing issue. And then lastly, just compliance assurance. We are supposed to provide the regulated community an idea of what constitutes compliance to ensure safety and best practices, right? So making sure that the owner-operator has access to those things are the most pressing. And then I would add, from a disaster perspective, what we're seeing now is that stressed facilities, stressed energy producing infrastructure is now being doubly stressed due to climate change, to extreme weather patterns, and we'll talk about Typhoon Merbok briefly. And so those are the kinds of things we're seeing now. So we're stressing an already stressed set of infrastructure that provides obviously life-saving energy for rural communities. So those are the big issues. And then post-disaster response, Coast Guard essentially taught FEMA in many ways how to traverse rural Alaska and how to provide post-disaster services. Most federal agencies are challenged to get into rural Alaska, and it makes it, and we're all challenged by that, but having the partnerships there to assist other federal agencies in doing the things that we do as a matter of routine is super important. And we have established a lot of those partnerships through and in coordination with our area committee, which is supported by our partnership with UAA. So what we try to do is really bring everybody together, all our federal partners and our state partners and other infrastructure and funding providers, into a room to talk about what we see out there. So to bring that full circle is really, we're out there, we're doing our mission that we would do anywhere else. We're collecting that extra data, bringing it back and sharing it with our partners that can provide training, that can provide extra funding for recapitalization of facilities that are stressed. So, thank you.
And if I could just chime in too for everybody's awareness, the red dots on the Alaska map are the locations of all the bulk fuel facilities in Alaska. And just for your situational awareness, one of the things that's missing on that map we were going to integrate was a picture of Iceland in it to compare the size of it. And just the state of Alaska alone is 14 times the size of Iceland. So just something to keep in mind as you look at the bulk fuel facilities that are listed on that.
Most U.S. Coast Guard units have anywhere from 50 to 70 facilities that they regulate. We have 400. And so we're challenged to get out there and ensure that the life-providing energy source, petroleum, is delivered safely. So, yep.
Thanks, Jeremy. Leanne, as captain of the port, and you mentioned sector commander for the past 3 years and more than 20 years of Coast Guard experience, what improvements have you seen and evolved? And in your opinion, what areas need the most ongoing attentions?
This is a great question. First of all, Alaska in the United States is kind of treated like an outpost. So many federal organizations don't actually have many people in Alaska. Most commonly, we see people in the state of Washington that are responsible for covering maybe 4 states like Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and then Alaska. So it becomes very difficult when people aren't living in the region, aren't physically there, for them to continue to advocate for the region and also be able and available quickly to respond during emergencies. And we saw this during Merbok. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we continue today, but Jeremy mentioned our area committees, and this is something that is unique to the United States that I'm aware of. The area committees is it's a mandate that exists for the Coast Guard. It's under the National Contingency Plan, and we have it basically gives every single person who lives in the communities the opportunity to have a voice on how we do preparedness for emergency response, for pollution response, et cetera. So it's a really unique, wonderful thing that we have. The committees are a fantastic opportunity, but the key is getting the buy-in and the participation into those committees. When I came to Alaska in 2020, my very first meeting as the captain of the port and officer in charge of marine inspections, and I had 5 different titles that I wore, or different hats that I wore in that position. But under the area committee construct, we had 120 people call in, and that was during COVID, to our very first meeting. I've never seen an area committee meeting like that, as robust as that, to the point that we had village mayors all throughout Alaska calling in to participate and be a part of the solution to the challenges that we face in Alaska. And Jeff mentioned how vast Alaska is. Very little of Alaska actually has a road system, so we're challenged in transportation, we're challenged in seasonality and the ability to fly in. Weather is a huge issue and often prevents us from responding. One of my very first cases that I had as the sector commander, we got the call on Thanksgiving Day, or a notice on Thanksgiving Day, that there was a spill of 30,000 gallons in, do you remember which village that was? I'm sorry, I'll think of it in a second, but a 30,000 gallon spill, and what our actions, we have kind of steps that we take for every single report of a spill. So we assign a person to be responsible for managing that case. The person reaches out to the village, gets more information, and then we decide if the team needs to travel, if we need to hire an oil spill removal organization, or if the village has it under control for their response, et cetera. In this case, we couldn't get a hold of anybody. It was Thanksgiving Day. Our person who happened to take the call that day had been in the village the previous summer, so he knew the people in the village, he knew the people that maintained the facility, but the way that we were able to actually get in touch with the village happened Saturday, so Thursday to Saturday. 72 hours later, he was able to get in touch with a Department of Interior person who rode a snow machine 2.5 hours into the village to let them know that the Coast Guard was trying to get in touch with them, who then called us back, and we could start talking about the response. And in this case, it was, blowing wind sideways, 50 knots. They had 12 feet of snow on the ground already at that point, and they had a mixture of slush. It was fuel and slush, and they were scooping it with like small buckets into a 55-gallon drum for their initial response. We were unable to get to the village until we caught a plane on Tuesday to a hub community, I think it was Nome, and then from Nome we were able to catch a plane, do an overflight of the area, but we weren't able to land because the wind was picking up and a storm was coming in. So they basically opened the door, pushed some protective equipment for the villagers to wear out the door, and then got airborne again, returned to Nome, and waited for that weather window to clear so they could get back into the village and see what happened with the response. That took over a week just to do that, let alone coordinate a response. And in the lower 48 in the United States, that would never happen. It would be same day, everything would be coordinated and probably removed by the next day or maybe 2 or 3 days later. So depending on the quantity. That's just I'm a storyteller. It's part of my heritage. So I apologize for that being very long-winded. You talked, Heather, about what improvements we've seen. Really, it's the collaboration among our partners, the collaboration with the villages, getting out into the villages, communicating and creating these really incredible relationships with the people that we serve, and developing that trust as a federal organization that hasn't necessarily existed in the history of Alaska, the history of the first peoples that lived in Alaska. It's a very delicate situation, and it's something that we hold very sacred in preserving that relationship and preserving that trust with the villages. Jeremy, you mentioned kind of the all coming back around full circle. So we go into the villages, we collect information, we look at the facilities, we understand which facilities are in the worst shape, and then we can come back and bring that information back to state agencies, federal agencies, look for grant opportunities, and make those connections with the villages to the right agencies who can help them make those improvements within their location, or even working together with other communities who have similar issues. So I think that is a huge win. Instead of operating in a silo, working among all of the federal and state and local agencies to provide assistance to the communities. So we're working smarter, not harder individually, right? When we're communicating like this and bringing that full solution, hopefully to the village, with coordination of the elders in the village and the people in the village to ensure that we're bringing the right services to them as well. I'll stop there, but I've got tons more stories, so we'll see what happens on the panel as we continue.
Thanks, Leanne. Leslie, as an industry stakeholder in an Arctic technology company, can you talk about how climate change is impacting infrastructure planning and emergency response?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to think of the current technologies that are being used for understanding what's happening in our environment. And we have a lot of dynamical models, which are like physics-based, but they fail when you don't fully understand a system. And in the Arctic, there hasn't been a lot of research from the institutions because it's been such a hard place to be able to get data. In fact, we were even talking to a group about getting some data, and they were like, yeah, we'll mail you a thumb drive. And we were like, what? No, we don't have enough internet connection to be able to get this data to you. And so that was even eye-opening, even being from Alaska and like having family there. And so these dynamical models are very good at like when we have understanding of like how two water molecules freeze together, but then we extrapolate into a bigger area, there's a lot of error in that. The other way is statistical modeling, and statistical modeling is based on historical data, but with climate change, it's not acting like it used to anymore. And so that's where those statistical models are failing. And that's why artificial intelligence is a great modeling technique to be able to understand that, because it's more responsive. Another thing for it is climate change is nonlinear. One of the things we love to do as people, as humans, is like say, here's a line, that's my trend, I'm gonna forecast on that. But climate change is nonlinear, and being able to use artificial intelligence to understand that system is really important, and why it's one of the premier techniques to be able to understand climate change and forecast for those changes. So we use artificial intelligence in our technology. We have three kind of main focus areas: sea ice, nearshore, and fisheries. We started with sea ice because that's been really important for the communities to be able to understand when and where that ice is going to be. You need to know that for like understanding when your last heating shipment can come in, or be able to know when the first one can come in for the next season. When is it going to be safe? When we were doing that, it really was important to understand the land-fast ice. And that is the ice that is stuck to the ground. It's not fast moving, it's fast stuck. That is a key leading indicator for when the ice is going to break up. And so we needed to know the near shore. And we started looking at a lot of near shore maps, and it wasn't matching any of the imagery that we were looking at. And then we started looking at the dates that like map was made, and the dates were over 100 years ago by lead line, where they had measured some of those. And so we were like, oh my goodness, like we can't use this data, it's wrong. So we ended up creating a new system where we were able to take a lot of different scientific techniques and mosaic them together. So intertidal bathymetry, satellite-derived bathymetry, and bathymetric wave inversion. And this is because the Alaskan waters are very muddy. There's a lot of groups that work in the lower 48 and like the Caribbeans that have satellite-derived bathymetry, which looks at the light attenuation in the water column. But when you're looking at Alaskan waters, it's mud, right? We have mud flats. in a lot of it, not in the Panhandle, but in a lot of the rest of Alaska. So being able to, you can't use that technique on a lot of parts in Alaska. And if you need to map and look and be able to find, we call it finding zero, right? Where does the land meet the ocean? And it's a moving target. It's changing with coastal erosion. And so we developed an AI that was able to mosaic those together so we can look at where that land is moving and remap that near shore so we can understand where that landfast ice is weak, where it's going to break, and have that leading indicator. In doing that, we were able to find out that the nearshore zone is such an important part of the habitat for the fisheries, and being able to understand that, and these water plumes for the rivers, and the turbidity in the water, and where those fisheries are going. And so that's the other thing that we're doing, is building an artificial intelligence model that is called an agent-based model or an individual-based model. But IBM is a computer to me, and I don't like to use that one. But agent-based modeling is we're modeling all of the fish at a high resolution. So we're actually modeling each individual fish in the ocean and how they interact with climate change and how that's impacting their breeding grounds, the cold pool, their predator-prey. And so we're getting a really high resolution definition. So we were hoping to do is be able to say, this stock over, this school of fish is overfished. You need to go fish this school of fish. So we can support a precision fishing effort that will increase the biomass of the fisheries. And being able to map those technologies, use those technologies to map this infrastructure, to understand where we're going, is so important for the response and the adaptation for climate change. And if we don't have these kind of technologies and these models, then we're going to really miss out on opportunities to prevent and protect some of our biodiversity that we tragically need to prioritize.
Thanks, Leslie. So we've kind of set the stage of all the infrastructure problems that we have. Jeremy, from a U.S. Coast Guard perspective, can you share any notable case studies or success stories related to mitigating environmental impacts in the Arctic, and who collaborated to bring about that success?
Yes, so there's a number of cases that that have challenged us and all led to unique solutions that really benefited everybody and allowed us to build a better and more mature prevention, preparedness, and response cooperative network of partners, right, in the state. So I think one of the first things we learned is we're very sensitive, obviously, to regulatory enforcement. We don't want to come in heavy-handed. We want to be a partner in developing and better protecting infrastructure and the environment, right? And so what we found was that we needed to do compliance assurance and compliance education, and we spent the better part of the first 3 to 5 years in inspections really kind of getting a situational awareness, a common military term, but we didn't know how bad the situation was. We didn't know if half the facilities were falling apart, or just luckily the bell curve, the most extreme cases are rarer than we thought, which was a good thing. But it also allowed us to triage. So what I'm getting at is as we started going into the villages and doing inspections more and more, we started meeting, connecting people like you and understanding technology and what people were doing out there to provide better response capability. But you don't want to learn that when you're responding to a spill, right? You want to have, and that's what the area committee is for. And just creating an area committee that people can attend requires more logistical support than the U.S. Coast Guard's able to really execute on, which is why we partnered with UAA to help us provide tech support for a virtual space that includes in-person and virtual attendees, right? That kind of thing takes a lot of work and effort. Finding meeting rooms and just doing that and making it so people feel welcomed to come in and share resources, share issues, so mayors can call and things like that. So as we were doing this, we had a case where in the Lower Kuskokwim School District, and by the way, there's of the regulated community in the state of Alaska, it's usually stores, local municipal governments, which include Alaska Native, like federally recognized tribe governments, and school districts. And school districts seem to be the most challenged from a regulatory perspective because they don't have the environmental compliance shops that some bigger corporations would, right? So what we found was the river was eroding, and it was impacting, it was starting to get closer and closer to the fuel tanks that support the school district. And so we knew this going in the first couple of years of inspections. We told them about it, and then when we got back in 2018, we found that the river was just too close. And so we talked to the school district about the problem. But what we found was that as we were trying to talk to them and encourage them to do something, we noticed that the school district wasn't going to prioritize the money unless the Coast Guard put it in writing. And so what we did was issued an Oil Pollution Act admin order that the captain of port signs and essentially ordered the school district to move the fuel tanks. And what that did was, it wasn't a punitive enforcement tool, it was just a notice to the school district, like, we know you need to take this action and we'd like you to prioritize that. So I think what we found, we were worried that would be viewed as an enforcement tool, but really it was just, we were able to communicate a triaging of funding related to the support of their energy infrastructure. And so that case in particular, we got a lot of thank yous about the support and the service we provided from the school district. And so it was really a lesson learned for us at the sector on how to manage these sticky regulatory situations that were really about preventing oil from getting into the environment and impacting, not only impacting their ability to heat the school, but impacting the environment that a lot of Alaska Natives live off of. And so that was important to us. And so I think that, and that sophistication of connection and collaboration is challenging in the best of days for a young service with not a lot of, that is resource constrained like every agency. So one of the success stories, another case was we had a lot of operators that didn't have appropriate HAZWOPER training or really they wanted more training, and the school district was supportive of it, but they didn't know how to access it. So we worked with the State of Alaska's Division of Regional and Community Affairs, DCRA, who was putting on energy classes, energy facility management courses. And so DCRA's whole mission at the state, and we just learned this, and it's not something that Coast Guard is used to interacting with state agencies on that. Usually we interact with environmental protection agencies, right? So DCRA is this organization that does nothing but help municipal governments be better at providing services to their residents. And so we worked with them, and they developed a special course centered around how to manage Coast Guard regulations for their bulk fuel facilities. And they integrated that into their larger energy management courses. So that's a huge success story for us. And so we're not going to make those connections or know who to talk to unless we're out there knocking on doors and making the area committee known to folks. Nobody knows what an area committee is unless you're doing oil spill response work, right? So all of those things, both the soft skills of communicating and collaborating, but also the hard skills of going out there and looking at the facilities and being sophisticated enough not to collect data that we're not legally able to collect, but to collect the visual and qualitative data to say, this facility is more in need of support than that one, and bringing that back to the Anchorage and coordinating with all our partners, Denali Commission, DCRA, or whomever, and the regulated community themselves and the contractors they hire to support their systems, and really have hard conversations about what's a priority, right, in a resource-constrained environment.
Thanks, Jeremy. Shannon, as the Senior Arctic Policy Advisor for the U.S. Coast Guard, what does the future look like, and what needs to be done to resolve the infrastructure challenges in Alaska's Arctic? It's a loaded question. How does the U.S. government approach Arctic policy and environmental impact mitigation from a national perspective?
Thanks for those softball questions, Heather. You go to any panel here, I can almost guarantee you somebody has talked about the future of the Arctic. I can say there is one absolute certainty with the future of the Arctic. It is very uncertain. So that's what's making the investments in building infrastructure so challenging. How do you build, how do you invest in infrastructure that may be overtaken by events? We're seeing very dynamic changes in the types, time frame, location of the physical activities there, seeing very dynamic changes across the environmental, the operational, the geostrategic environments in the Arctic. Very challenging to address, again, from that infrastructure perspective in particular. Now, this wouldn't be a Coast Guard presentation without somebody talking about icebreakers, so I'm going to use that to pivot to them, because icebreakers are our infrastructure, our near-term immediate needs on infrastructure, because they allow us to surge, to be where we need to be, when we need to be, to execute not only Coast Guard missions, but national missions across the Arctic. It's very challenging for us, but that's why we invest so heavily in them. That enables us to surge with all those changes as all those changes happen. So what are we talking about in terms of how does the government approach Arctic policy? So first it has to start with very clear messaging, and I think for the first time in a really long time, we have that across that national spectrum. Last October, the administration published both a national security strategy and a national strategy for the Arctic region. A lot of people don't realize that that national security strategy has a fair amount of Arctic in there. They have a very specific section on the Arctic, and there's a lot of other global aspects in that document that apply to and through the Arctic. And then again, you have the very specific national strategy for the Arctic region. Ambassador Bolton is talking about the implementation plan soon to be released for that document. Coast Guard has published 2 Arctic strategies, the first one in 2013, another one in 2019, and we are soon going to be releasing our implementation plan for our latest Arctic strategy. And I mention these because you have to be clear on that messaging, but you also have to act as if the Arctic matters. Our implementation plan for both the NSAR and for our strategy get to those points. Here's the things that the Coast Guard is doing, will continue to do to help improve that national security environment across the region. I'm looking at your other questions here. So how does the environmental impact mitigation from a national perspective? One thing that's common across all of those strategies is there's elements in there that talk about disaster response and community resilience. You can't meet those national objectives without the infrastructure to do that type of response and to build that resiliency across the communities. And why is community resilience so important for the Coast Guard? If the more resilient those communities are, the less that we're having to go into those communities, the less response that we have to do. We have limited capacities. That's our biggest challenge from a Coast Guard perspective. Capacities to address all the things that we're asked to do across that Arctic region. So we want to build that resiliency so that we're not taking on more risk because we move assets from one emergency to another emergency. If Russia and China are operating in our waters, for example, we have to pull assets to go respond to that, which means we have now increased risk in other areas from if there's a disaster of some kind, whether that's man-made or natural, if there's a search and rescue case, for example, or fisheries enforcement. It's managing all those risks across the region. So building that community resiliency, building that infrastructure, that helps us meet our national missions across that region. I'll stop with that. Thanks.
Thanks, Shannon. Leslie, how can the private sector support sustainable development in a culturally sensitive and respectful way?
Thanks. I think this is such an important topic. And obviously, being Alaska Native, it's fundamental to our business. And the kind of 3 pillars we really use with this are permission, protection, and prosperity. And in that, permission is making sure that you are wanted there, right? What are you providing? Is that actually something they need? Or is this you telling them, like, this is what's going to happen. Protecting is making sure that you're not extracting or taking advantage of certain situations. And then the prosperity also is to make sure that there's economic development, that it's sustainable in a way. And an example of how we've done this in the past is we did a project with the community of Sanikiluwak in Hudson Bay, Canada. And even though the Nunavut Fishery Association and World Wildlife Foundation and the communities were the ones that asked us to do it, it was really important for us to actually get the community's engagement and understanding of what we were doing, why we were doing it, and what, like, in their data that we were going to be using. And so, because they had this data, it was called the Nunavut Coastal Resource Inventory, and it had been collected through interviews with a bunch of the elders. And it was really important that when we're using that data, we're using it in a responsible way. So even though the group had asked us to come do that, we made sure we talked to them, we wrote them a letter, we explained what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, and how we were going to protect their data going forward. And so we were able to take and blend the community's local knowledge with more institutionalized remote sensing and universities' data to be able to then train a neural network to extrapolate to new areas for food security. And one of the important things for this is, as a business, we were not required to publish anything. And so we could protect their data in a way that others couldn't. And we could tailor the project to what they needed. And I know that's a big challenge for a lot of government, is they have to serve everyone. You can see that, like, they're spread thin. Alaska's huge, and one size doesn't fit all. So to be able to do what the community needs, to be able to support that in a really tailored, individual way was really important to us. And then the last thing was, actually, it wasn't part of our program, but we gave them, we're like, all right, here's all the information, here's all the data. And they're like, this is great, we love it. They validated the results. They found new places that the community could do subsistence activities. And they're like, we're going to present this to the community. And we went, with the help of a translator, translated all of our documents into their local language, because there was a lot of people who were only unilanguage. And we wanted everybody to be able to see it and read it and understand it, because what we're trying to do is actually help them. And so we actually translated all of our results so they could be able to understand and read it, and it wasn't just some report that was going to sit on somebody's desk and kind of gather dust. And I think all of these things, this permission, protection, and prosperity, are fundamental in what we do as a business to make sure that we are being ethical in how we engage and react and create those kind of tailored products.
Thanks, Leslie. Jeff, I haven't forgotten about you all the way down there. How is the University of Alaska Anchorage contributing to addressing environmental impacts and infrastructure challenges in the Arctic? How do you foster stakeholder collaboration to achieve a sustainable future for Arctic coastal facilities? How is the University of Alaska Anchorage assisting with these challenges? And what are the next steps for some of the university to help?
Okay. I think probably the biggest strength that the University of Alaska Anchorage has is that we listen. And then we can address these problems through our collaborations that we have, especially with Coast Guard. A lot of talk has come up about the area committee meeting work, and that's the Arctic, Alaska Arctic and Western Area Committee meetings that Coast Guard offers. It's a huge initiative for us to undertake and work with them, and then hear the problems and sit in on some of these workshops and events and activities that are ongoing. And then we can engage different subject matter experts that we may be partnered with to help liaison different rural communities, maybe subject matter experts, faculty that are either at UAA, within our university system at large to help out and address some of these challenges. The big piece, I think, obviously, I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of different centers that I provide oversight for, but those centers are soft funded 100%. So we're pretty good at writing grants and contracts and doing soft funded operations. So part of our listening to our collaborators and our stakeholders throughout the state of Alaska to address these issues is writing grants to help support this and these endeavors to these really difficult challenges that Alaska is being faced with. And obviously the big initiative, right, where the university system, part of our biggest component of our mission is higher education and building the next generation of individuals. So our university system offers hundreds of different degree and certificate options that are associated with workforce development programs, training the next generation to help address these issues. And working with Department of Homeland Security, as well as Department of Defense contracts and Corps of Engineers, we're really able to bridge in and find these subject matter experts. And if we can't find the best of the best in Alaska, we do outreach to find the best of the best in the lower 48, national collaborations, international collaborations to address these issues and bring the right folks to the table to make sure this happens. And we've done that with Shannon and U.S. Coast Guard headquarters, as well as other state, federal, municipal, tribal organizations, because the university serves as a neutral venue for all entities to come to that's unbiased, and it's a great location to house these efforts, and then also integrate. I see Coast Guard Academy cadets here as well, which is great. But integrate the next generation of folks to be a part of these initiatives and understand the challenges and the difficulties that we're facing. The other thing that UAA really is great at is we're really flexible and adaptable to these changes. And that comes with different degree and certificate options in-house. We have one of the most advanced non-destructive testing programs in the nation. And that program uses phased array technology, ultrasonic detection equipment, X-ray technology to look at bulk fuel facilities and pipelines, piers, docks, et cetera, to understand sort of what's happening with corrosion levels, what that rate looks like without visually being able to see it externally. And we're training the next generation and working with business and industry to address those challenges that we have in state before these disasters happen. That's a good example of a great program. We also have an accredited testing facility that's authorized through the American Welding Society that looks at different corrosion rates and how to join different materials together so that they can hold up to these harsh conditions in the Arctic environment. And as part of the next sort of chapter of building the next generation to help this, we've run an Arctic Summer Internship Program that's also funded through a Scientific Leadership Award through Department of Homeland Security. And that's contracted with us through 2028 at this point. And we take folks from mostly minority serving institutions across the US, and we bring them to the Arctic so that you can actually see the challenges firsthand. And between last year in 2022 and 2023, there was acres of shoreline that vanished. Then we couldn't even take the ATVs out to get to Point Barrow. That's how much land was gone within 1 year after the typhoon that folks have mentioned. And when you bring students and all over the world, actually we had students from Australia that even joined us. Harvard was there. University of Texas, El Paso joined us. It's just a great, great trip and experience to actually see what's happening firsthand. And working with Shannon Jenkins over the years too, we've hosted hundreds of workshops, I think, at this point, especially the Horizons workshop where we do tabletop exercises in-house and host people in Anchorage and kind of in other venues too, to bring the best leaders together to address these challenges. And being an outside federal agency, we can really put all of the best pieces of the puzzle together and integrate students in the work that we're doing. It's such a big challenge to make sure that we're building the next generation. There's been a lot of talk about that at this conference since we've been here, but we're all getting older, and it's really going to be up to the next generation to address this as rapidly as we're seeing things change in the Arctic and addressing the challenges of rural communities and our indigenous folks and maintaining the subsistence lifestyle that they rely on and the cultural significance of the importance of our native communities in Alaska. It's a foundational piece of the University of Alaska Anchorage, and we're blessed to be a part of it, that's for sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add something too. As I was listening, you talk about building the Arctic practitioners, and one of the things that we talk about response work, and Captain Luss retired, and I have spent a lot of time managing these things, but we rarely go out in the field. We're sending 18 to 25-year-old petty officers and junior officers to the field to actually take on this work. And if you look at the the map over there, we've colored, like, we've broken up this huge state into regions, and we do something that not many, well, no other Coast Guard unit that I've ever seen, is try to identify communities that are connected in some way, whether it's river or whatnot, and really take on communities uniquely, because not one size fits all, and every Alaska Native community is different and has different challenges, and we are need to be better at understanding those challenges, and understanding the various government entities there and respecting all of that and respecting the culture. And so that's hard to imbue on a new petty officer who came out of boot camp and their A school, right, to learn how to do an inspection at a facility that looks a lot more like ConocoPhillips on the North Slope than, you know, a school district's fuel farm.
Yeah,
So, right, and so just using so to that effort is like really building that at the national level through a Coast Guard Academy cadet programs, and really using Sector Anchorage and our Alaska-based Coast Guard units to assist in building that future workforce to understand these issues is key. Yeah.
And kind of our research capabilities are just endless. It's great, but having these conversations and putting these leaders together and then thinking about the challenge of it, right? We just talked about oil spills in the Arctic. Well, what happens when oil gets trapped under ice, right? So that comes up in conversation. Well, and at that point, you know, we start developing long-range underwater autonomous vehicles that can actually map oil under ice. We're using unmanned aircraft systems to look at and look at high-definition video footage and photography to look at bulk fuel infrastructure that's along Alaska's coastline, and finding the best subject matter experts to deal with those issues. We also came up with an environmental risk index project to work with Coast Guard that looked at all these bulk fuel facilities listed on this map and then identified priorities, which ones are we in jeopardy for, and what's going to happen when oil does get trapped under the ice or there's a catastrophe, and how are we going to deal with it. And we have some other oil spill modeling programs that we work with, but having partners like Polarctic in-house and finding the subject matter experts, whether it's business, industry, private sector folks, other federal agencies to come to the table to address these challenges is crucial. The other piece too is our registered apprenticeship program that we recently developed. We have a really unique opportunity, as I mentioned. We're very flexible at UAA, but we came up with the first of its kind apprenticeship program for researchers, and it supports undergraduate and graduate students, but we place them in active applied research projects with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they're getting paid on the job while they're out actually doing the work for the university, and they're getting college credit at the same time, and it's a really great and fun opportunity. I encourage you to take a look at it, and we're advancing fellowship opportunities, and it's really a great program that's underway. So, yeah.
I think, go ahead,
I
Jim.
want to amplify something that Jeff said. He talked about all the workshops that they've done for the Coast Guard. Why do they matter? Well, you have a lot of people in D.C. I talked about all those national strategies that are out there now. You have a lot of folks in D.C., very well-intended people, but I also see a lot of people writing policy that have never touched the Arctic. These workshops, one of the great benefits to me is that ADAC has assembled these experts across that Alaska region to come to one place so that I can go out, you know, a policy wonk like me, I can go out and I can talk to these folks and understand it from their perspective. So our good idea fairies back in DC can actually translate into policy that is going to hopefully make a difference, assuming we act on them. But that's the intent behind it, and that's the value of working with entities like ADAC, is getting these experts together, vast network across Alaska to be able to do that. But that's also the value in events like this. This is where I collect a lot of national or international level information, understanding maybe how our policies are being perceived positively, or maybe not. But that's why we want to come to events like this, engage with communities like this to understand that both from a local to a global perspective. Thanks.
So we're out of time for question and answers, but after this panel, they will love to answer any of your questions, especially Shannon. He loves all the questions. But I'll let the panel briefly give final thoughts. Leanne, did you want to start with final thoughts?
Mine is why do we care about bulk fuel facilities? And I'll do this really quickly. Hopefully I can put this in perspective. Why are they important? Basically, the villages and the communities receive one fuel delivery a year. That's it, during summer season when the water's open and the barges can move up and transfer fuel to those facilities. There is not another way to replenish the facilities except for via air during the harshest seasons of the year, which we've already talked about. Air travel is very, very hard during the winter season, and it's very, you can't schedule it, I'll say that. The fuel powers the generators for the villages. It provides heat, power, provides fuel for the vehicles, snow machines, etc. If they have a spill, they lose their fuel. It becomes a state emergency in the state of Alaska for the state to try to figure out how to get fuel back to the village. If they do it by air, the cost goes up increasingly, drastically. When you're talking about like the quantity that a barge can bring in versus the quantity that can be brought in by an aircraft, a helicopter, that's incredibly difficult to be able to replenish if they have a 30,000 gallon loss, a 60,000 gallon loss. It's going to take a long time for that to happen, and that cost is just going to continually increase. If we see fuel at $5 a gallon in Anchorage, it's going to be $12 a gallon in Ukqiavik. We have other remote villages that are $18 a gallon. If it spills, we're also talking about contaminated environment, groundwater, toxins for fish, wildlife, human exposure, and then that all leads to food insecurity, environmental insecurity, which all feeds into national security issues. I'll wrap up there because I know we are
out of time.
Out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, final thoughts quickly? Anyone?
I'll just add that Ted Stevens Center, Arctic Domain Awareness Center, Arctic Circle Assembly, all of these things where we come and talk about Arctic issues are important because they are unique and they require new collaborative solutions. Not any one entity organization can take them on.
Thank you. We look forward to future collaborations and discussions with you after this panel.